This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin today's show with 2022's top 10 ag law developments for the year from K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen. Roger highlights the USDA's emergency relief program and the definition of farm income. The conversation continues with Roger highlighting his top 2 stories for 2022, California's Proposition 12 and the Major Questions Doctrine with the EPA. We're also joined by Kansas Forest Service State Forester Jason Hartman. Jason shares the Kansas Forest Service's new mission statement and highlights all that the organization can provide to Kansans. We end with this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster answer a listener's question on concerns with grazing and providing supplemental feed to multiple species of animals. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Roger McEowen. He is our K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor that joins us every other week with an ag law update. And this week, we're going to be talking through the top 10 ag law developments for 2022. So, Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Samantha.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to have you actually in studio. Makes things a bit more fun. Yeah. So we've got a lot to talk through, and we're going to work for the bottom up. So number 10 came in as the USDA's emergency relief program and the definition of farm income. So let's talk through that.
Yeah, this was a big deal for 2020 and 2021 when that program was developed. It's a virus-related piece of legislation, but you had to have a certain amount of farm income to be eligible to qualify for this. The problem that came up was with the definition of farm income and whether that included trades of equipment. You know, you could generate some income from trading tractors and combines and so forth. And since 2018, based on the 2017 tax law, we no longer route those through Schedule F. So it doesn't show up as farm income. It goes on a different form, Form 4797, where we eliminate self-employment tax. And the USDA's position was, over complaints from some of us that were encouraging them to change that definition, was that would not count in the definition of farm income because it wasn't showing up on Schedule F. So that's a big issue. You could have a farmer that would have a lot of trades in a particular tax year, and then they wouldn't have sufficient farm income to be eligible for this relief. And that's the issue.
Moving on to number 9, another USDA issue, a decision to not review wetland determination upheld.
Yeah, this involved a South Dakota farmer who ended up having 0.8 of an acre of a puddle in his farm field as a result of some conservation a tree belt that his grandfather planted in 1936. And as that developed over the years, the trees matured. Of course, it snows in South Dakota in the wintertime. That snow would melt, and it would find a spot in the field where the water would collect. It has no drainage associated with it. And about half the time, he couldn't farm it without draining that off himself. The other half of the time, it would evaporate or soak into the soil, and so it wasn't a problem. USDA came in and certified that as a wetland, which meant that he couldn't farm it without losing his subsidies. And he pointed to the statute saying, I'm entitled to a recertification. I can appeal that, and you have to come out and look at it again. Well, USDA had developed a regulation that said, no, you can't do that unless you can show that circumstances have changed. That wasn't in the statute. That was in their reg, and so the case was over whether that was a reasonable interpretation of the statute. Farmer lost in the trial court, currently on appeal to the 8th Circuit.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out for sure. And another one that's still playing out, this next story, number 8, dicamba drift damage litigation. Obviously, this is still an ongoing issue.
It's ongoing on the punitive side of things. The court basically upheld the compensatory damages, but they threw out the really large punitive damage amount. You know, we're in the millions and millions of dollars worth of damages on this. This involves Missouri's largest peach farming operation. And this litigation has been going on for some time. There are other cases. This was not part of the class action litigation. They went separately on this, but still a huge judgment that came in. It was separated between the compensatory damages as well as the punitive damages. We're on appeal now with respect to the punitive damage.
Absolutely. And number 7, the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, misnamed is a good way to put that. This really has nothing to do with reducing inflation. It's basically a green energy bill, kind of the light version of what some in the Congress were wanting. But it does have a few tax provisions in it that are important for us. It's got a lot of funding for ag programs. Basically, the Congress is throwing all kinds of money, billions and billions of dollars at various things, and a lot of it's ag. So there are a lot of ag conservation programs, different types of incentives that are out there for farmers under this legislation.
Just a bit of a misnomer there. And then number 6, case law and legislative developments concerning ag-gag provisions.
Yeah, I hate the term ag-gag, but that's how it's referred to in the media, so I'll stick with it just because that's what people are familiar with. These are these state laws that try to provide some level of protection to livestock confinement facilities from those that want to do them harm by lying, for example, on a job application so you can get access to the inside of a packing plant, for example, or a confined animal feeding facility, and then you can take clandestine videos and put them on social media out of context and then create all types of problems for these operations. And so states have come in and said, well, you can't do those things. And, of course, the challenge to these in the courts is, well, that's a restriction on free speech, and so it's unconstitutional. And we had a number of court cases in 2022 from Utah and Idaho and Kansas and Iowa, largely saying that these laws are unconstitutional, which creates a problem for the state legislatures in terms of, well, how do we protect these animal businesses, these livestock facilities, and at the same time do it without violating the Constitution? The Kansas case involved the Kansas statute, went to the 10th Circuit this past year, and was held unconstitutional, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Part of the Iowa statute was upheld as constitutional. Part of it was deemed to be unconstitutional. It'll be an issue that continues on in 2023.
I was about to say, a tale as old as time, that one, I feel like, and one that, like you said, we'll continue to see play out just as things change, the environment changes in terms of what's accepted and what's not. Moving on to number 5, a story that's been, again, just in the news a lot lately, the WOTUS final rule.
It seems like this issue has been around ever since I started doing these things 30 years ago. We've had a significant U.S. Supreme Court opinion on the definition of a water of the United States about 16 years ago. That didn't clear up the matter. We had the Obama administration come up with their own definition in terms of the administrative agencies. The Trump administration came up with the National Water Protection Rule, and now the current administration has changed back to where we were prior to 2015, and they brought in this significant nexus test, which the courts had trouble figuring that out. It led to a lot of lower court decisions on that, with courts being all over the board. And this is currently an issue that's also before the U.S. Supreme Court in the Sackett opinion that's coming to us from Idaho. And I'm somewhat disappointed that the agencies, meaning the Corps and the EPA, came out with their rule prior to the U.S. Supreme Court opinion. I wish they would have waited until the U.S. Supreme Court decides the Sackett case. Maybe we'll get a clear definition of what a WOTUS is. But now we've got this rule that's out there. It's going to go into effect middle of March, and there are already lawsuits against it, and we'll have to see if the U.S. Supreme Court's going to clear this up once and for all. I tend to think that this is probably, again, another one of these issues that's going to continue just to be there and antagonize a lot of farmers.
Yeah, a messy situation for sure. And our next one's a bit more broad of a subject, but number 4 is just economic issues we face this year.
Yeah, economic issues in general, very big in 2022. We see inflation that's been at the highest level in 40 years. We've got a money supply that's out of control, which is driving that inflation. We've got just crazy energy policy that's also contributing to inflation. We have wage inflation. We've got all kinds of problems. In terms of agriculture, the economics in ag right now on the beef sector, demand is pretty good. Pork, not quite as good. Poultry's got all kinds of problems with avian flu, and that's going to continue into 2023. We've seen this with price of eggs, just outrageous. I just had a call from an individual on the East Coast about 10 days ago as we record this, and they paid $8.99 for a dozen of eggs. It's just unheard of. So general economic issues, grain markets are going to be still in some turmoil because of the war that's being fought in Ukraine, what's happening happening to world grain markets. Prices are still pretty good for farmers. Land values are holding up, but interest rates are rising and have risen. And so the input loans that farmers are getting in early 2023, they're at a higher rate of interest than they were a year ago. So that's going to squeeze some farmers in that respect. Machinery prices are still high. And so we've got some turbulent waters as we come into 2023 and a number of things that we're going to have to watch with respect to the farm economy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think economics is going to be on the mind of many as we continue into 2023. And I don't think that's going to subside anytime soon, unfortunately. As we come up the list even further, number 3, the Endangered Species Act regulations.
Yeah, there were a number of changes in 22 with respect to endangered species. The definition of what habitat is, eliminating some rule changes that were made in the Trump administration that private landowners thought were pretty good, because the problem with endangered species from a landowner's perspective is that we have a majority of these species that have a major part of their habitats on private property. So we're not just talking about the Endangered Species Act protecting species on in national parks and other federal lands. No, a lot of their habitats on private property. And if you have a species, a protected species or an endangered species that's found on your property, then it really curtails your farming activities. And so that's a concern. And so we want very carefully thought out definitions of what habitat is, what take is, and all those rules. Many of those rules changed in 2022, not for the benefit of private landowners. And that's why I have it as number 3 on my list.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've done a lot of discussion over take and things like that because of the lesser prairie chicken, and its ruling now is threatened, and that's still pending. It's on a pause where that's not going to be put in place for a while now, but still something to be cognizant of.
That's right. Yep.
We're about to cut to a short break, but when we return, Roger will share with us the top 2 ag law stories of 2022. 2 stories that we still have a lot to follow up on in this new year. Following our conversation with Roger, we'll be joined by one of our state forester friends from the Kansas Forest Service, Jason Hartman, and he'll be sharing with us the organization's new mission statement and why they felt it was time for a change. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we are continuing our conversation with K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen on the top 10 ag law developments of 2022. We left you on a bit of a cliffhanger there, but now our conversation continues with the 2 biggest ag law stories of 2022. Well, now we're on our top 2, and I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anyone, Roger, unfortunately, but number 2 coming in is California's Proposition 12.
Yeah, that's an issue that's currently before the U.S. Supreme Court, and obviously, however the court decides this is going to be one of the big issues in agricultural law in 2023. But this is this California proposition where they passed this, and now they've got a law in California that says that you can't sell pork products in our state unless they are produced in a manner that we approve of in California. Well, that manner is not the way that pork is produced in the major pork-producing states such as Iowa, for example. And so you lose the California market unless you conform your business practices to what the California legislature has said. So what you have here is one state governing the ag practices in another state. And so that's the question before the Supreme Court is, can a state do that? To what extent can a state do that? What about retaliation? What's to prevent this? And the court really struggled with that in oral argument as to finding the line as to what's permissible state action and what's not permissible. It brings in Commerce Clause, Dormant Commerce Clause, kind of those legal terms that are out there. But this is a big issue because that California market is 13% of the national market, and you want to have access to that market. California doesn't produce pork. It's virtually zero. So these rules don't affect their producers. This is 100% extraterritorial effect. And so what California is doing has 100% effect outside their state borders. That's going to be a dicey issue for the court to deal with. I'm waiting to see what the opinion is going to be on that one, but that's a huge issue.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people are hanging on the edge of their seats for that ruling. And especially, like you said, the retaliation aspect of it all. If this snowballs, if this is allowed and it snowballs into something bigger, could be, huge and very detrimental for many ag industries.
Yeah, what's to say that Iowa couldn't come up with a law that says, well, you can't sell almonds in our state unless you handpick the almonds because we don't like the trees to be shaken. We like trees. We don't want the trees to be harmed. Where does this silliness end? And the Supreme Court's going to have to figure this out and give us some clear guidelines on this.
Absolutely. Thank goodness for them. I wouldn't want their job. Moving on to number one now. This is a huge story that we've been thinking about for a while now. But number one, the major questions doctrine.
This was a U.S. Supreme Court opinion this past June, and this one is so significant. It's easily number one this past year because this really changes the whole administrative state of the federal government. We have a lot of rules that are in place as a result of administrative law, not because of anything that the Congress passed or a state legislature, if we're talking the state level. Now, this is federal level. But this involved an attempt by the EPA to basically change the manner of energy production in the United States away from fossil fuel into so-called renewable type production without Congress passing any type of law, without Congress saying this is what we're going to do in terms of what the rules are. And normally the administrative agency's only role when we have the Clean Air Act at issue here is to set rules under which certain businesses operate to comply with the law. You can't just change the manner of production by regulatory mandate, which was what happened under the Obama administration. That finally got to the court, and the court said, when we have an agency doing something that involves a policy decision on a national scale, that invokes what's known as the major questions doctrine, and they can't do that. That is a matter for elected politicians to either stand on or get voted out of office on, not unelected bureaucrats. So it is an opinion of monumental importance in terms of the administrative state in this country, and it really pares it back to give kind of a sense of the founders that, look, it's the elected bodies that make these major policy decisions that affect the whole country, not unelected bureaucrats.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not even just a question of the EPA, but other bodies as well that lie within our government and things like that, like you mentioned. And it's a matter of you uphold the policies put in place. You don't create them, like you said.
That's right. Yeah, you can set forth the boundaries within which certain businesses and economic conduct takes place consistent with the purpose of the law. You can't override what that purpose is by saying, in this instance, we're going to shift the entire manner of energy production in the country. Well, the Congress can do that, but an administrative agency can't, and the court set it straight.
Well, Roger, I know you talked about all of these top 10 cases for 2022 in a blog post recently, so if listeners want to read that, where can they do that at?
Well, there are two ways to do that. One is to go to my website, which is washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, or the K-State Ag Econ Ag Manager website.
Well, I'll link to both of those in the show notes of today's program, which as always can be found on agtoday.net. But Roger, as always, thank you so much for your time. It's always wonderful to have you in studio.
Thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, that was K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen joining us for this week's Ag Law Update, focusing on the top 10 stories of ag law developments for 2022. We're continuing our programming now with one of our friends from the Kansas Forest Service. His name is Jason Hartman, and he is a state forester with KFS. And he's joining me today because they have put together a new mission statement. So first and foremost, Jason, before we talk about this new mission statement, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Samantha.
Absolutely. So like I said, KFS has a new mission statement for the entire organization. What brought about the idea of a new mission statement?
Well, it's a combination of timing, really, in the way that it'd been a long time since we'd looked at strategic planning mission statement for the agency going back clear to the mid-90s. And so it was time. It was past time. And also just it coincided with some other efforts in KSRE and the College of Ag for some strategic planning professional assistance that we took advantage of. And those pieces all fell into place at a time that we really were thinking we need to relook at this. You know, there's different parts of our programs that are becoming more prominent, becoming larger portion of what we do. So we really should look at encompassing all that we do in our strategic planning and therefore mission statement.
Absolutely. So as the organization evolved and as you looked at the changes that have taken place, what did you guys develop as this new mission statement? What can people expect to hear from you guys now?
Okay, so what we came up with, and trying to, like I said, capture a little more of the breadth of what we do, we came up with the Kansas Forest Service. What we're about is sustaining and enhancing the natural resources and communities through forestry and wildland fire management.
Wonderful. Well, that's straight into the point of, I think that encompasses quite well everything that you guys do.
Thank you. We tried.
Yeah. Great effort. And if those listening aren't familiar with really the Kansas Forest Service and what all you offer, obviously you guys offer a wide array of things. You know, you mentioned sustainability, fire safety, things like that. So let's talk through really what the Kansas Forest Service can provide listeners.
Yeah, what all we're trying to capture there.
Yeah.
So we have kind of 6 main program areas where we have we're the Forest Service. So we have foresters. They're out there across the state serving landowners that have a woodland forestry, agroforestry, like a shelter belt windbreak need, or just wanting some advice. So that's what that aspect is for. We work with a lot of partners in that, like NRCS for cost share agreements, things like that. We also do likewise with our communities, especially our smaller communities, provide them with that technical service of their treescape, tree health, things like that in the community setting of parks, street trees, things like that. We have our seedling sales every year, conservation trees, seedlings that we provide for those like shelter belt windbreak plantings.
Those are going on right now, right?
That is, yeah, that's going on through May.
Wonderful.
And then we provide forest health assistance, utilization and marketing assistance, like keeping track of who's in the business of milling timber for folks if they want that resource, and providing sawmill information, things like that, and other types of markets for forest products. And then the 6th one is our wildland fire management, where we're assisting mostly rural fire departments with training, equipment, and suppression assistance as requested.
Wonderful. Well, obviously burn season is quickly approaching here. This will be my first year experiencing that here in Kansas. So I'm not from Kansas, so I've got a lot to learn still in that area. So I'll probably be reaching out to you guys more in the future to discuss that more on the show.
Happy to talk about it, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, if anyone is tuning in and maybe they want to take advantage of that seedling sale that's going on, or they're wanting to learn more about, managing their trees that they have on their property, how to best do that, how can they reach you all at the Kansas Forest Service?
Probably the first stop would be just go to our website, kansasforest.org, and just navigate through there to reach the contact you need to reach, or our state office is 785-532-3300.
Well, I say we end with one more reading of that mission statement because I think it really does just sum up your, organization services so well. So let's end with that.
Okay. We're sustaining and enhancing natural resources and communities through forestry and wildland fire management.
The Kansas Forest Service, everyone, a great organization to take advantage of. So if you have any needs that fall along any of those categories, be sure to reach out to them. And I'll list all the resources that Jason just talked through in the show notes of today's show. So if you're interested, you can find those on agtoday.net. But Jason, thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Jason Hartman. He is a state forester with the Kansas Forest Service, joining us to discuss the new mission statement for the Kansas Forest Service. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we'll be back with our friends from the Beef Cattle Institute for this week's edition of Ask the Experts. This week, experts Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster answer a listener's question on grazing and feeding supplement to multiple species of animals. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. We're ending Agriculture Today programming with our friends from the Beef Cattle Institute for this week's edition of Ask the Experts. This week, we're joined by experts Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster.
Hi, welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where our experts will answer your questions. Happy to have these two experts with me today, Dr. Brian Lubbers.
Good morning.
And Dr. Phillip Lancaster.
Good morning.
We answer your questions. Always appreciate it. If you want to send us a question, you can email us at bci@ksu.edu. And as they provide their answers, they each get points, up to 10 points. Today's question comes from a listener, and they wanted to ask, are there any concerns with grazing multiple species together? For example, horses and cattle, or sheep and goats and cattle, and providing them supplemental feed. Phillip, I'll go to you first.
One of the first concerns that always comes to my mind from a nutritional perspective with cattle and small ruminants together is the mineral supplement that you're using, because cattle need a higher mineral requirement for copper than small ruminants do. And unfortunately, the toxic level of copper for small ruminants is below the nutritional requirement for cattle. And so a cattle mineral will easily create toxicity issues in small ruminants.
So even a regular cattle mineral?
Yes. And so if you're going to graze them together, you've got to figure out some way to feed mineral separate. It's really hard to keep sheep and goats out of the cattle mineral because the cattle are much bigger and you can't keep the smaller animal out of an area.
It's sometimes hard to keep sheep and goats exactly where you want them anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Good answer, Phillip. So 6 points for Phillip. Brian?
I mean, I think what we're talking about in general terms is, the species differences in metabolism, whether it's minerals. And I'll give an example. So cattle and horses, one of the things we would really be concerned about is the ionophores. So monensin, rumensin, horses are extremely sensitive to the cardiovascular effects of the ionophores. And there have been instances where horses have gotten into the feed bunk or into the feed shed, consumed some cattle feed with monensin in it, and we have some toxicity death issues. So kind of along the same lines, yes, there are some concerns. If you're providing supplemented feed, I would be concerned about putting those two species together.
Excellent. So 6 points for Brian also. Now, Phillip, you guys talked about the negatives. Give me some positives.
Well, I think from a small rumen perspective with cattle, grazing on the same pasture, or maybe even you could do it as a staggered rotation to keep those mineral supplements separate. But those animals consume different plants and different parts of plants to different extents. And so I can use sheep and goats kind of as weed control because they're going to want to graze the higher quality leaves off of a lot of those weeds or broadleaf plants, and so that helps control those in the pasture. Whereas cattle are more of a what we call a grazer. They go out there and take big mouthfuls of everything. They're not as picky as sheep and goats, which we tend to call them browsers, and they're going to be a little bit more picky on what they consume.
But okay to be a little picky if they're picky about things that others won't eat.
Exactly, exactly.
So 8 points for Phillip. Brian?
I guess the advantage of co-grazing multiple species together, the reason we do it is generally labor savings, right, or space limitations. We've got one pasture, we've got one set of fences, it's just a little easier to manage. And I'm going to go back to another downside, though, with that, especially cattle and horses, is I think you really run the risk of overgrazing. And especially with those two together where they aren't co-grazers, where they're picking different species to graze on, they're eating the same things. And so beyond toxicity things we mentioned earlier, I think one of the other downsides that you need to think about is, are they eating the same things, and are you overgrazing that one pasture you've got?
Absolutely. And I think, Brian, you hit a couple key points there in how cattle and horses are going to be hitting the same forages, and they're going to be potentially overgrazing, which you may be able to compensate with, but it takes more labor, which offsets the labor that you were trying to save as you go in. So great points there. Brian ended up with 9 points today. You guys made some excellent discussion areas relative to what are some things to watch for, but certainly I would talk to your nutritionist or your veterinarian if you're thinking about considering that to make sure you get the ration correct. Thanks for joining us. As always, if you have further questions, you can send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, those were K-State experts Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster. That concludes today's programming. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.